What are now my policy proposals? As I said, we are in a trap, and anything which an economist says we should do can be identified by some other economist as leading to terrible implications. I tell you that before. This is always the case, because we do not really have a solution. So one has to be a little bit courageous and say something. So what should we do in this mess? Should we just continue with this wrong path, or should we do something? I think we should do something rather than going into permanent stagnation. The first thing is a debt conference. We have to forgive some of the public debt, the bank debt, and the target debt, which was built up for some of the countries. How much for which country is difficult to say. That's subject to the negotiations. But for the creditor, I think it's even better to accept the truth and write off some of the debt rather than foreseeing a period of permanently low interest rates. That is also a huge loss. If maturities for rescue credits are extended to the middle of the century and the rates of interest are driven to zero, then you also lose your money. It's an implicit haircut, and rather than having an implicit haircut, you can have an open haircut. The open haircut has the advantage that after it, you can return to normal interest rates. And then at least you would reduce the incentive to keep borrowing. With this strategy, the incentive to solve everything by more borrowing is unlimited. Okay, we have political constraints, but they obviously don't hold. Then the second would be would allow for temporary exits. If we don't allow it and an exit just happens, there's a lot of turmoil. But if we create rules for an orderly exit, I think it can more easily be handled. I call this a breathing currency union. Not a currency union where you just can enter and never exit. This would be a prison. But one where you can enter, stay, and if necessary, in the case of emergency, you can temporarily exit, devalue, and later return. This return option I would always combine with it. I find this essential to give the people hope, to stabilize the economy. Those countries would enter the ESM2 category, which we have already, as an entrance gate for the euro system. And if you make the return dependent on some reforms, I think this would also be a strong incentive to carry out the reforms. Anyway, if Greece exited, went to the drachma devalued probably by 50% or so, then the Greek people would not buy the imports anymore to that extent. They would not buy agricultural products from France or olive oil from Germany as they do, but they would go to their own farmers and buy the products there. They would have more jobs. Rich people from Greece, who at least have brought 100 billion euros outside the country, might return because everything is so cheap, open new factories, and try to make a bargain out of these low wages. And then later they could return. Of course, banknote conversion and so on is an issue. I discussed that in the book. I would give them the banknotes they have. But I don't want to go into these details now here. And third, after the haircut, after the debt conference, the debt is sustainable by definition if we have done it properly, but then we should go to a system of harder budget constraints. Soft budget constraints, to use this term of János Kornai, who in 1980 predicted the fall of communism, is not good for any system, certainly not for a market economy. The main theorems of welfare economics have not been able to prove for the case of soft budget constraints. These are always hard budget constraints. Only if individuals face a budget constraint which is as rigid as the aggregate budget constraint which nature has given us, can a market economy function. And here in particular, I think we need a system to settle the target balances. It is not possible that a country like Cyprus just prints half a GDP if they are in need to bail out Russian investors. This is not possible. and just writing into the books a debt with regard to the ECB system, which is serviced at the main refinancing rate, now 0.05%. We need a settlement system, and here I advocate the American system. America has 12 districts of the Fed, and there we have exactly the same problem. It is possible that one district issues more money than is needed for internal circulation, money which in net terms goes to other districts for buying goods and redeeming debt or buying assets. But then there is a debt between the district Feds, and this debt has to be serviced. It used to be gold until 1975. There was a internal gold standard in the United States. That is, that central bank which carries out the payment orders for others, which in a sense gave the others therefore a credit, is entitled to be financed with gold if this balance doesn't disappear by itself. And now, since 1975 in the United States, we have a settlement with ownership shares in the open market portfolio, which are regularly once a year reallocated between the local central banks. Something like that we need. That would make it less attractive to solve the problems with the printing press. If someone is in need of credit, he has to go to the market rather than to his central bank. In the end, my dream still is, and we have recently prepared an EAG report on that, a European confederation following the Swiss model. I think Switzerland shows very clearly that it is possible to combine different languages, cultures, and so on into one state. It is possible. But we should carefully see under what conditions this can be done and what conditions have to be avoided. The most important condition to be avoided is debt mutualization. Debt mutualization never works. You can't have a joint responsibility for your debt, because that encourages to borrow more. That drives down the interest rates, and at lower interest rates, the wish to borrow is infinite. There are two models of federation or confederation. The one is the debt mutualization model, as we have it in Europe. So we have public institutions that imply that the countries mutually stand in for each other's debt. Be it the ECB with its OMT program, be it the ESM with its various rescue operations and so on. So these institutions mean for the investors they don't have to be afraid that they don't get their money back, because if a particular country goes bust, it's someone else who pays. No? Drives down the interest rates. But then we need some constraint. We need debt constraints in order for this not to explode. And here in Europe we have the fiscal compact. We have the old Stability and Growth Compact of '96, and then in 2012 there was the second compact. It was hardened by saying that the debt-GDP ratio each year has to decline towards 60% by 1/20th of the distance to 60%. That was Mrs. Merkel's great achievement in 2012 in these negotiations. But you have heard what Valls and Renzi said about the compact. They don't want to respect it anymore. You cannot implement such a compact and constraint. It simply doesn't work, because you have no authority really to make sure that the budgets are not going beyond the limits. The other possibility is the liability model. Every state remains liable for its own debt, meaning that there are bankruptcies, potentially, and a bankruptcy means there is a bail-in. That is, the creditor loses his money. Not the taxpayer, the creditor loses the money. That's the idea of a liability model, if the debtor can't repay. And that will, in time, lead to high interest rates, because if a state overborrows, the creditors become nervous, require high interest rates, or even more, they don't give the credit at all. So there can't be overborrowing. This is the American system. No one in America thinks and even discusses about bailing out California. California is bankrupt, In the summer, the teachers don't get salary. For a couple of years, California paid for the goods it bought from the private sector with IOUs. These are debt certificates which the recipients could then use to pay for the electricity bill and what have you. The federal state in America does not come to help California. Neither does the Fed help California. The Fed buys not a single government bond of the states in America. Not a single bond. They don't. In particular, not from the crisis countries. If the ECB was operating in the United States, it would now buy the government bonds of California, of Illinois, of Minnesota, which are at the brink of bankruptcy. But the Fed would not do it. Of course, they buy the federal government bonds because they have a federation, they have a common budget, and so on. That's what they do. But that's a completely different issue. They do not carry out local rescue operations as we do it here in Europe. The United States had tried a different model. They had tried the debt mutualization of the European kind in their initial years. But it did not work out well. This is Alexander Hamilton, the first finance minister, who in 1791 mutualized the state debt by lifting it to the federal level. Then there was a second round of debt mutualization in 1813 in the Second War against Britain. And the result was that the states thought, oh, well, you can easily borrow. The debt service is not your problem. We will lift this on the federal level, and then the federation will have to take care of it. There was a strong incentive to borrow. They borrowed to build roads, canals, other parts of the infrastructure. There was a credit boom in the United States. Everything seemed well for a while. But then it turned out the states overborrowed and became bankrupt. From 1837 to 42, 9 of 29 American states and territories went formally into bankruptcy. And the others were so close to bankruptcy that they could not take over any of the burden. Nothing but hassle and strife was the result of this attempt to mutualize the debt. Alexander Hamilton had thought that the debt mutualization would be cement for the new American state. But in fact, it turned to be the opposite. As historian Harold James from Princeton University argued, the fiscal union proved to be explosive rather than cement, because he drew a direct line from 42 to 61, when the War of Secession began. And clearly the War of Secession had other reasons, the slavery problem as we know, but he argues that the unresolved debt problem contributed to the tensions between the American states and therefore contributed to this war. Only after the War of Secession did the Americans then decide for the new system of liability. So each state is liable for its own debt and no one comes to help. Meaning that the creditors rather than the taxpayers of other states bear the burden. And that system has given America stability up to this day. Rather than reinventing the wheel, I think we Europeans should just mimic the Americans and the United States of America. Thank you for your attention.